questions and he'd answer them. He'd sit down, give him a question and then start answering them. But this one is obviously come with a particular subject in mind. And the transcripts are literally describing, well, the recording of the words he used, as much as we can get them. They were recorded on reel-to-reel, old Grundig tapes and stuff. And in fact, the idea of even recording as a document was fairly new. I think people bought tape recorders to get, you know, the dog barking and holiday sounds and Auntie Nellie playing the violin and stuff. They hadn't really thought of using it as a documentary sort of resource. So apparently they used to come on and stop, and somebody else would take over, and there'd be 2 or 3 machines there. So what we've got is the best available, and we've got as many words as we can. I don't think there's many missing in this, and the chap that did the transcript is John Bailey, who's sitting on my right here. And it's important because one of the diagrams hasn't come out, it still hasn't come out very well. It's so it actually looks wrong, but it is right on John's original, which is if you've downloaded it and you've got a better printer than me, you'll have a better image of that. It's on page 8.
Shows the nodal points.
Yes, showing the nodal points of vibrations. I've got 8 in my mind, but it might not be there. That's it, it's on page 5, yeah.
Have you got the one pair? Alan's got some spare pairs.
I'll get the it gets you a little bit.
Yeah.
Every time I move it's currently looking at that job.
And of course, if you downloaded yours and printed it, you might have a different page orientation than the one which you've got on here. Because I've sort of shifted the font around to try and get it onto 18 pages rather than 19. Always frugal.
Well, actually, it's set.
Is it? Yes, yeah. Well, mine's, I've still done the 18 one, so probably missed any. Right. It won't matter greatly. Won't matter greatly. And so he very rarely used to name his titles, so it is unusual to actually have a title which he's given. And the subheadings are those which the transcriber, John in this case, has added in to make it more reasonable and to make it more accessible to research, so you can find pages and subjects easier. And also the diagrams are the ones that John thinks are appropriate for that particular situation. He describes them, and you can hear him drawing on the tape, but we haven't actually got exact copies of these, so we don't know.
So I wasn't there, so just wrapped up.
Best guesses and John's dreams, or nightmares. Right. So.
Sorry, Al, have you got a spare copy for me?
Yep. Thanks. Would anyone like to shift to a better seat before we start? Because I'm going to start. And there's a lovely seat sitting here going back.
If I move forward.
Yeah, you could.
I'm conscious of this squeaking. I know, there's quite a few hard chairs squeaking.
You should know about the squeaky chairs with the presentation. Right. So. This is the man himself. That's a sort of afternoon do somewhere in Manchester, and that's what he looked like towards the end of his days. And he's obviously explaining something to somebody. He was always sort of explaining something to somebody. He really is quite special, actually. His name is Eugene Halliday, and he died in 19 87, and we're still talking about it. The people that knew him still talk about his ideas and the way he put things across. And I think I want to say any more about this because this talk very quickly shows the depth of his thinking and the way that he carries a subject forward. I don't know anybody who does it in quite the same way as he does, and I've heard an awful lot of people. And he still seems to be able to, I think, catch things at a level of understanding which is quite profound. I hope you get the same impression from it. What I'm going to do tonight is go through the talk, explain bits which I think need explaining. If you find other things that you'd rather suggest that we talk about, that's fine. Other than that, it isn't a greatly prepared thing. I've read it several times and I've done this talk with different people and different groups, and it's always different. So by all means, if you have a question, ask as we go through. It's meant to be talking through, and I'd like people to be as involved as they can be, bearing in mind that this is a document which is really quite old. And what actually struck me the first time I did this was that the access we've got to him now is really amazing, because he used to come to Liverpool from Manchester. Somebody used to bring him. He'd walk in and he'd do a talk like this, not from notes in any way. What you're getting is literally what he spoke, without not reading it from any notes. And then he'd go away. And of course, without the recording and your notes or anything, that was all you got. Next week there was a completely different subject, and we've got something. Is there something like 250 talks?
Yeah,
250 talks.
250 of his sort of lectures, and I've got about another 70
Oh.
of one-on-ones.
Wow.
People like Fred Freeman.
Yeah.
It's still the same. It's still
Yeah.
basically, as Zio used to say, Eugene did what Eugene did.
Yeah.
You know?
You can see in there, he's actually talking to somebody, explaining something to somebody. And I went to one of them fairly early on in my relationship to him. We went to Salford College of Art, where he was lecturing to the students who had never met him before. And his talk was exactly the same as this. He was talking about the tarot pack, and considering that they were art students, I don't think they knew what they'd let themselves in for. But the level of talk, I think, was amazing. But they all stayed. I mean, that was an hour and a half lecture, and 3 hours later we were still in there talking, and nobody had left. So, but I don't. He was never any different than this. This is the way he talked to me when we were alone together, in exactly the same way. But he never stopped drawing as well. So that's the point. In other words, what I'm saying is, it's worth focusing and going through this to try and get from it. And of course, until now, this has not been possible for most people, because we didn't have these transcripts. And most people wouldn't have had all the talks. A lot of people had, 10 or 20 or something. But to have them all accessible freely is really amazing. And that's thank you largely to Bob for getting them up there and making sure very few of them got lost.
And Josh in Scotland.
Josh, yeah.
Now
Yeah.
has got the site with the transcripts on.
Yeah.
So a wife and a young boy, so he does what he can when he can. But we think we've got, most of us
Yeah.
involved John. Well, most of us think we've got everything available, and it's in its pure form.
Yeah.
It's not, and as Martin pointed out, it's probably the first time in the history of anybody who talks about subjects like this that you have access to something that's not mediated by some form of gatekeeper.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you can make up your mind right away. And a lot of us came into this like on talk 74.
Yeah.
And we never felt that, hang on, I'll listen to the other 73, be all right then. You just,
Yeah.
it was the most extraordinary.
It's like a ball of string, because there is, in that sense, you start where you start. He does actually get a lot of groundwork in this one. The three-part man, etc. I think is very, very important, sort of key into the way he understands things. But yeah, so we all started at odd places. I mean, I didn't meet him until 72, I think. So he didn't stop just for me, he just carried on as ever he was. And when you saw him talking to strangers, he still talked in exactly the same way. And he always seems to include you. And it does this with this fairly quickly. And so I'm going to start reading it and then just stop where I think we need to outline some things. And please jog in if you think anything is missing out. Sanskrit. It was pointed out last time I was here that it is possible to learn a lot of theory without this theory ever becoming operative in the organism. So tonight we're going to talk about something we have referred to before, but in a little more detail. How to make things operative. So he's saying it's very easy to get a lot of ideas and not actually do anything about them. In fact, I think everybody does that for quite a period of time. You gather ideas, and then there comes a point when you feel, well, I've got to do something about these, otherwise it's just going to fizzle, or I'm just going to become a talking shop. And so this is what he's saying. Ideation, cognition. And we'll have to go back to our primary diagram and look at the human organism in dynamic terms. Dynamic means moving, that's all literally, dynamic or moving terms, energetic terms. If we were to use the orthodox psychological terminology, the function of the brain, particularly of the forebrain, is what they call cognition. But we prefer to call it ideation. Because the idea in cognition is the idea of seeing things together. And it's quite possible to present in the mind a series of discoordinated ideas. And this could be called ideation without cognition. So straight away we've got something here which I think needs to be sorted out a little bit. What he's saying, and he's doing a good philosophical thing, when you go to any university philosophical session and say you must define your terms first of all, and what he's doing is defining his terms, so he's going to tell you how he's going to be using words right off the bat. And he's doing it by picking up on the fact that there are, using orthodox psychological terminology, they use the word cognition for what we would call thinking. And he's saying it's the wrong word. Cognition is right for thinking, but of a particular kind. Now you can see what he's going to say is that cog in cognition refers to a particular function and in that thinking process it's the fitting together of forms, fitting together of shapes. What he means is, if you've got ideas, you have to have them relating together for them to function together, and that's the point of cognition. But a lot of people don't have relationships of ideas in that sense, or it's possible to have just one idea in isolation, not relating to any others. We've probably been in that state, and he says, so therefore, it doesn't cover all the processes or what most people have in their mind. It covers some of them where they're relating together. That part of a cog is literally where one shape, one cog, fits into another. And they actually move together and influence each other. So what he's saying is that there's a dynamic relationship between those two very badly drawn cogs that I've just put on there. Does that make sense? Mm. And sometimes you have just thought which has not got a multiple of other thoughts which it relates to, and it's in isolation. So it would be better if we use the word ideation, because it's a broader term. Does that make sense? Is everybody okay with that? And notice what he's doing. He's immediately laying down definitions of words so that we can discuss them. Philosophers have to do this because we all use words in uniquely different ways, and we all express ourselves in different ways, but with the same words. So before we have a discussion, we have to lay out as a sort of ground rule how we're going to use a word. And he's discussing the psychological terms, and he wants to change them because, as far as he's concerned, their references don't actually tie up very well. Okay? Because the idea in cognition is the idea of seeing things together. And it's quite possible to present in the mind a series of discoordinated ideas, and this could be called ideation without it being cognition. It's possible to ideate, to present ideas in the mind without comprehending what they mean. each idea can appear in the mind, become fixated or displaced by another idea without any real comprehension of the relation. So for this process in the head, to keep it quite basic, we'll use the word ideation, and mean the presentation of ideas whether singly or in groups, serially, one after the other, or simultaneously together. Okay, so he's actually picking away at the psychological orthodox term there and saying it's not suitable for purpose. But in doing that, he's drawn our attention to the way words fit together. Cognition is actually a recognizable creation of little syllables that build up into a complex word. Very important for his ideas because he's talking all the time that our vocabulary needs to be understood by us as being a complicated thing, and it's been built up out of small things added together. And if you break it down into small bits, you find you recognize and understand it quite easily. Okay? So he'll be doing that a lot. He'll be taking the words back to their root meanings and back to the syllables, and the first time you see him doing it, it's quite surprising. Okay. Feeling. Affection. The term used in psychology for the feeling life is affection. You know that popularly this means being fond of something. If someone says, I have an affection for them, we mean that we're fond of them. But it also in psychology means the contrary. It means to dislike something. When they refer to the affect, they are referring to the way a stimulus affects the organism in terms of liking, disliking, and therefore the affective process, we can give a plus or a minus value. What he's saying in that point, in terms of the stimulus, it could be the taste of something, it could be the sound of something in the ear, it could be the way something strikes our eyes. Affection means, in this psychological term, that you get a response, whether plus or minus, whether you like it or dislike it. We normally use the word to mean being fond of something. If you say, I have an affection for this particular flower, we mean we like it. But he's saying, actually, the way the psychiatrists use it and the psychologists use it, it actually means all that, liking and not liking. And so they would logically locate that area of the feeling life as being more, I'm going to move him so we can draw on the board, more specifically the whole realm of affection. Right. Now in a moment he's going to use anatomical terms, so I'm going to get in early and say that it will help us at this point to put in a little diagram, and the diagram he used to use, which I'm going to try and copy here, is literally one called a three-part man. And he's referring to head, heart, and belly, as he used to refer to them as. And what he's doing, of course, is he's putting these psychological terms, and we'll put those in a moment, and he's relating them to these different levels of a human being. Now, this immediately uses a metaphor which he's describing, pulling in the sort of things like the yogic system of chakras. It's also discussing the whole area of romantic literature where head and heart are constantly battling, and where desire and push is actually battling as well. So he's relating it to literary and mythic themes, but he's also locating it distinctly in the physical body. And this is because he's going to say these psychological effects are not just psychological. It's not just the mind we're talking about here. We're talking about a mind which is engaged with the body. And that means you have a two-way feedback. You have the mind which is affecting the body, and also the mind the body affecting the mind. You've got a unity here of mind-body, which is an interaction with the universe. And stimulus is coming at it from outside are going to affect it at all levels. Probably. Not everyone, but most of them will. Okay. Are we still alright? Everyone going with this? Fine? Great. Group participation, that means yes, that means no, okay. Right, so he's going to jump right in. The function below the diaphragm, you see, psychologists call conation. So he said, first of all, here we've got, he's using ideation. There, instead of cognition, I'll just put cog there because he's actually refuted that word cog, for that reason we gave you. Here, the psychologists use affection. And he's saying, no, we'll call that the heart here, and we'll say that this is the like and dislike. So, like and dislike, which he's simply putting down as plus and minus. So we can say that like is plus, minus is negative. Okay? So he's already sort of mapping out the human and relating it directly to how we experience ourselves. Okay, so we've got ideation up here, or we normally call it thinking, feeling level down here, emotional level, and now he's going to talk about conation, which is a word that's probably new to you. It was certainly new to me when I first heard it, using the description by psychologists, but it has a very interesting root actually, and so again, as he would say, if you follow the route, you've got a deeper understanding of what it could possibly mean. The function below the diaphragm, the psychologists call conation. And conation means basic drive, absolutely basic life urge. It can appear in a differentiated form as sexual urge in man and woman, but the sexual urge as polarized is already merely a secondary behavior of the primary conative drive. Conative drive is simply life energy, pushing itself away from where it is in some direction which is not yet determined by idea. So he's putting down here conation. And the diaphragm actually is here. That's why he sort of draws this diagram, I think, in this way, so that he can relate here the diaphragm, which is the separation of this area in the body from that area, because he would say that there's a great deal of turmoil that happens here between those two levels of experience. And this is literally what we could say is a push. When the psychiatrists talk about it and the psychologists talk about it, they say it's literally an unthinking, you don't know why it is, but you want something, or you want to move from where you are to somewhere else. In other words, you're chasing something. We would tend to call it desire or attraction, but the important thing being, it is not felt as a feeling state or thought through clearly in some sort of a formal way. It's actually experienced as just a want. Okay? That makes sense to it?
Yeah, it's an urge or an appetite, isn't it?
Yeah. Urge.
Because there are some urges you don't know where they come from. You just don't know where it comes from.
No.
Like I saw somebody the other day in the workshop, and I just felt like hitting them across the back of the head. I don't know where it came from. Obviously, you don't carry them through, but intelligently.
Some folk do.
They do, yeah.
Now, one of the things which he did on another occasion, which I found fascinating, was that he said, what you can say is that we're actually tuned in at a different level, and what's going on here can't be understood in many senses in terms of the individual. It needs to be understood in greater terms. For instance, the sexual relationship is to do with the species. So at a certain, it isn't a thought process. It isn't that you decide that you're going to have children, he would say, or you feel it's a good idea. That might be the case, but actually what happens is, for most folk, it's a drive which moves them in a particular way. So he used to say you can actually draw it in a different way. You can draw it, if you're drawing concepts like that, you could say, excuse me a minute. You don't get any of this, with PowerPoint. So he would say you can actually draw the force like this of the species, and you could draw the human like this, and that belly area is part of this great cycle of periodicity, so that there is a certain period of time, lapse, which every time when it comes through a human being, it inspires that drive inside them. And it won't just be the sexual one, because that's reproductive and literally the preservation of the species, he would say, would depend also on status. So you're driven to be above other members of your species, and also, of course, food. Because if you're not alive, you can't reproduce, and the species is actually driving you to those things. Let's put sexuality in there. The species drives, which are acting upon everybody who's got a body. And so we know that everybody experiences them, and they come round, literally driven, and he would say also, very significantly driven by sun energy, because that's the energy which is actually driving the whole process with the seasonal things, which are affecting through the plants and through human beings, through the animals and through ourselves. Does that make sense? So he's abstracting them away and saying they aren't even yours, you know. So that sex comes at a certain age and picks you up and says, this is something I can use. And at a certain other date it says, right, no use anymore, I'll drop you like a hot potato. And if you actually identify with it, it can be quite devastating, because it's got nothing you can do about it. It came and then it went. It was not there for your benefit, it was there for the species. You can use that energy, and he was very significant sort of about the fact that you can certainly use it, because it's got a lot of get up and go in it, but it isn't actually you. And so when that happens, you have to be very careful about how you use it, and you have to direct it in some ways, otherwise it will literally use you rather than you use it. You can ride it like a horse, and one of the symbols of it would say in the tarot pack is the small child riding the white horse, or in Chinese philosophy you've got a man riding a bull. You often see them in chip shop windows, and it's a significant point that neither the small boy on the horse nor the man on the bull has got reins. So you don't control it by force or by pain, you control it by being inside it. You guide the whole process. And the Zen series of pictures about the boy and the bull, he would say, are exactly to do with how you get in touch with that energy, become it, and then it literally obeys you, becomes you, and you can use the energy without being dominated by it. And that is one of the great life lessons which is worth learning, because that energy passing through you, you can use. If you don't, it will use you. So that's one of those ultimatums, if you like. Are we still okay? Am I making sense? Okay, good, good. Right, so we got those psychological words which he is, if you like, qualifying in his way to extend them into our physical bodies, into the world at large, and trying to describe the areas and how it's working. And he's also saying it's written into the language as well, because what he's talking about here are basic ideas which are formed by human beings, and so therefore are essentially created in the structure of the language. The function below the diaphragm, the psychologists call conation. I'm just at the top of page 2. And conation means basic drive, absolute basic life urge. It can appear in a differentiated form as sexual urge in man and woman, but the sexual urge, as polarized, is already merely a secondary behavior of the primary conative drive. So in other words, we think of it as masculine or feminine, but of course, as a species thing, it's just to do with conative drive. Sexual urge, the behavior is to recreate and continue the species. Cognitive drive is simply life energy pushing itself away from where it is in some direction where it is not yet determined by an idea. It hasn't come up here yet, there's no understanding of it, it just feels that's something I want. If we look at the word cone, and we draw a cone, and we draw it dynamically, energy spiraling in and converging to a point. Dynamically just means representing movement. energy spiraling in and converging to a point, that is the meaning of conation. But right at the tip of this point here, it can condense no further. So what he's saying is that that drive is actually homing in on something. It starts off fairly wide of the mark, and then it narrows down, and it defines itself, narrows right down to a point. Normally when he draws that, he doesn't draw it from sideways, he draws it from above, and he's saying it's like, creating energy, pushing into a center to actually create something, whether that's a universe or a person or an atom or whatever, or an idea or whatever it is. It's being drawn in by energy, narrowing itself down, focusing in, and producing a point. And that actually would be, first of all, a drive that came down and through, becoming and focusing itself in that particular process. So I'll just read this paragraph. You bear that diagram in mind, and it's the one that John's got there, right alongside it. Energy spiraling in and converging to a point. That is the meaning of conation. But right at the tip of this point here, where it can condense no further, that is an idea. Remember, idea is a Greek word for form, borrowed through the Latin. The Latin word forma, form, is the word used to translate the idea, the word idea. The Anglo-Saxon word shape has the same meaning. He often says this in the lectures, and it's very important, otherwise we can get confused with these words. He's saying idea and form and shape all mean the same thing. So much so, they're not similar, they are the same. Idea, form, shape, you can use them interchangeably. That's the Greek, that's the Latin, and that's the Anglo-Saxon. And they mean the same thing. So when it makes an idea here, he's saying it's made of shape, it's made of form. And that links it in with lots of other philosophies and things. If you realise that those three words are just literally different emphasis from different areas of the world on what is essentially a basis of all sort of understanding of the world. When we look at things, we realise they've either got shape or they've got force. That's essentially what the Buddha analysed the world down to, and it's a pretty good one. So, it simply means the circumscribing or limiting of an energy. Circumscribing means draw a line around something and you know its shape. The shape is what we use to define it, to recognise it and to describe it. If I turn that into a little fish, I'm doing it by manipulating a little bit of its shape. The shape is by what we recognise a particular form. The form is the only thing which is separating, and I've actually drawn around a piece of space to do that with a line. So I've created an idea, form, or a shape there, out of paper, out of matter, out of atoms, out of wood, out of whatever it is. I've actually made a particular shape, or a particular form, a particular idea. And when you know a shape, you can locate it, you can formally determine its shape. So we can talk about an idea of a triangle, which is a Greek word expressing the shape of a triangle, or the form of a triangle. Shape, form, and idea are synonyms, which means they mean the same thing for this purpose. Conation is driving along and progressively condensing towards an idea. So this is push. I don't know what it is I want, but I know I'm starting moving towards something here. It's narrowing down a bit, but I'm still not sure. So this is the conation, this area, driving down into a situation he's talking about. Condensing towards an idea. And this conation comes from the infinite, and it winds itself in. It's a self-inwinding process. And if we write at one end idea conation, kona, we could really technically put the T at this end where it reaches its formal conclusion. So that process there, he's going to say, is a T form because it's actually blocking itself. And up here we can put the word kona, because that's the activity of coming into a coning situation, and that's got a very old root, and so is this here. Halliday used the fact that he considered all letters to actually be descriptions of engineering terms of how energy behaves. So that T form is literally when something locks against itself. The perfect form of a T is like that, and it's two energies meeting. And he said that is really the only way the universe has found to fix anything. The whole universe is movement. Everything is moving. The only way you can get a fixation is if it moves in the same pattern over and over again. So the fish only stays in being because there's energy actually holding it in being, and when it decides to go, it lifts it and that thing fades away to nothing. To fix itself, to hold itself into a particular form, the energy is holding it like that. And that's the only way you can create a location, is by energy constantly establishing that location, saying over and over again, where these two things intersect, I am holding by energy. This energy pushing against that energy is holding that being. He would say that's why that form of the cross is a sacred symbol, because it's a locational point in eternity and in infinity. When energies establish themselves like that and keep going back to that state and restating it, it means that that thing is a form which is being held by energy. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. You're awfully quiet. I'm getting disturbed. Why that's important is because what he's saying, of course, is that the universe, before it started to form, was just pure movement. The universe is only movement, and the movements pattern themselves into shapes. When we recognize the shapes, we can talk about the shapes, but we can't talk about the movement behind them, except in terms of what the shapes are. So we call these things atoms and situations, countries, worlds, planets, whatever we call them, societies, groups, but actually they're just created by movement which keeps repeating itself until it doesn't. And when it doesn't repeat itself, those things melt back into the field of movement. You know, they're still there as movements perhaps, but they're not being constantly restated, so we can't know what they are. And that'll happen to us, and it happens to absolutely everybody and everything in the universe. It creates these things out of movement, being constantly stated and referenced, and then when it's done that for a while, it just lets them go. That allows those to go back into the great movements of the universe. He would say they're still there in movement, but they're no longer being emphasized constantly by an energy which is referencing them and saying, I'm holding this in being. It only ever holds anything in being, including the sun and the Milky Way and everything. It only holds it in being for a time. It then lets it go back into where it came from. Sometimes longer and sometimes shorter. It's our problem, we get attached with this literally form as it appears, rather than attaching ourselves to the beingness, which is the pure energy.
So even so-called particles, subatomic particles, they're just movements.
Yeah.
Everything is movement.
But we can't talk about what the movement is only in terms of the shape that it holds up, which is what he's going to move on to in a few moments actually. The fact that, you know, these things are describable only into the orbits in terms of, you know, if you like, in terms of physics, or literally the knots of those orbits and how they relate to other orbits, chemistry, etc. These are only descriptions of the patterning that movement holds to while it's holding it. So, in this sense, I think, you know, he's trying to analyze for us and describe a situation which is directly related to us, because we feel those levels inside ourselves in our everyday life, and he's relating them to the way the world is working here. Is that right? Do you see the relationship between the two things? actually that should be the other way up.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Because, yeah, and he's going to say that in a moment, but he says that there's a reason why they describe it like that in terms of conation, psychologically, because it's the way they want to reference it.
If they don't like to think there's something more intelligent than there.
Yes. Yeah. Conation is driving along and progressively condensing towards an idea, and this conation comes from the infinite and winds itself in. It is a self-inwinding process. In other words, we don't know why it does it, it just seems to do it. And if we write at one end conation, cona, and at the other end we can put the T at this end where it reaches its formal conclusion. You know that an ion is a charged atom, which is either positive or negative. It could be a negative ion with an overbalance of negative charges, or it could be a positive one with an overbalance of positive charges. But the ion at the end means the progressive motion of a nuclear and orbital system. N means continuity of motion. So here he's described what a letter T is in his system, and he's describing here that the N means continuity of motion. In other words, that shape, which we put down as an N, we use that, just that one bit, means continuing of motion, and it's associated with the thinking process because we can recognize something that continues. So whatever we do recognize is something which we have seen before. We recognize it because it happens regularly. So we could say that anything which has a periodicity, in other words, time, all those processes start and come round again and have a repetition. It's only because we've seen it before that we can recognize it and form it into a thought process, and we recognize in that continuity a form, something which we can say, oh, that's the seasons. I remember that spring, we had one last year. Or, this is the working day, or this is literally the law, the role, the significance of life. And all those words, he said, are based on rota. So anything that rotates like that, we can literally organize, and that is the root of what he's talking about here, of nucleus. The root of the word nucleus is a little nut, from the Greek. Through the French, the tiny thing, what they saw here was a little cluster of something which had been formed out of that process. And they chose a word which means a little gathering of something that wasn't there before. So a little cluster of things, they said it's nuclear. It's got an orbital energy, and it's actually got a central cluster of something, which we then analyse down into different types of movement, which are protons, electrons, etc. The Kohler probe, oh, by the way, if you're reading this, you've got a little time code there, which John has kindly put in, which says 5 minutes and 1 second. So if you want to literally check up what he's talking about, or how he described it, and literally listen to what he's saying, in case John or someone else has got it wrong, you can check up on. Because it's obviously, nowadays with recording, which is so well codified and organised, you can go right to the actual sentence that you want to check out if you care to do so. The Kohler process has exactly the same meaning as the Gyna process or woman process. In gynecology you're concerned with woman. This is a word for woman borrowed from the Greek. In Arthur's Bride, the Lady Guinevere means true woman. So what he's saying here is, look at where these words come from. Now, that rough kona there, when you use a C, you either use a C as an S or as a K. It doesn't have a single sound of its own. In English we use it as an S or a K. And he's saying if we're using it as a K sound, kona there, in the Greek it's gyna, with a letter that we don't have anymore, which we're representing as with a Y, an upsilon, and that would be in the same root there. If you allow those two sound shifts, which are quite legitimate, you've got the old word for literally a woman. literally a coming, a gathering together and a creation movement, if you like, towards fulfilling something and bringing it into the world. What we've drawn here is actually a cornucopia, if you look at it. You know, remember that old symbol, you sometimes see it on Christmas cards, of a cornucopia. Something which is bringing from infinity something into the world. Sorry, I'm doing it the wrong way around. Bringing from infinity something into the world, and here it has all sorts of plentiful things like food and whatever, and beautiful objects and jewellery and treasure. And it's the horn of plenty, it's bringing things in. Now, gynecologically, you're actually talking about the fact that there are processes inside the female body which turn an egg, which is a tiny little process, into a full-grown human being. And it does it by a process of gathering together onto a point and then unwinding out and growing the thing larger and larger and larger, which is how we got here in the first place. We are part of that cornucopia. We came from the no place into a physical form, and that will slowly dissolve and take us back into the no place again. The Kona process is exactly the same meaning as the gyna process or woman process. You know, in gynecology you're concerned with women. This is a word for woman borrowed from the Greek. In Arthur's Bride, the lady Guinevere, now Vere has come from the word verity or truth, and Guina is exactly the same word as this again, gyna or Kona. So he's actually saying Guinevere means true woman. She's the true woman in the Arthur story. She actually behaves in a very womanly way by not quite making her mind up as to which man she was. It has been said, not by me of course. It means true woman, and the same word has been by sound shift turned into Kona. So that fundamentally the Kona function means the kind of movement that is tending to converge, tending to objectify, tending to formulate, but has not yet done so. So this process here, he's describing that as being written into the language, as being describing this process of bringing something into objectification. Let's try to make this slightly different. We've come from infinity and we wind in, tightening as we go, until we come to the term of tightening. If we like to write up here spirit before it begins to wind in, I'm going to say that the white paper, if you like, is the spirit, and he's talking about coming in, winding in, becoming more and more formulated as we come in, from spirit, which is literally pure, unformed consciousness. It's consciousness, but it's got nothing to be conscious of. It can only be conscious of literally movements which happen within its substance. So once it starts to move, it's very conscious of the movement until it brings that movement into some form here, literally some form or shape that can be recognized. Tighter and tighter it moves in, more restricted as it's coming in. Each one of these is more and more compression, so it feels itself more and more held in, more and more formed, because it's got something to push against. Becoming tighter and tighter, more restricted, more forming, and the point of the greatest formulation, here we have an idea, a form or a shape. We could say here that this line of free energy strikes against and bounces off this closed circle. We've written the letter K, and this means to close, to strike, or inhibit. Again, using his descriptions of letters, there's a form and there's something striking against it. You've got a letter K drawn in terms of simple form of one thing resisting the striking of another, like an arrow form hitting it. And the letter K he's representing as being like that. So again he's drawing what we can describe as an engineering description of a particular movement that the universe makes. The letter O is here, the zone that we're talking about. The letter K at this point here, when it actually strikes itself because it's so closed in, it actually hits itself here as a K. And the N means the continuity of motion, so as this progressively inspiring occurs, we must keep writing K-O, actually on all levels, and we write in the N for the continuity of that process. Okay. So he's describing here the way anything is made, the way everything is made, bringing it from nothing into something. This here is something, this nothing here is not what we'd say non-existent. It's beingness, but it has no form. So there's no way of recognizing itself until it starts to make something which is recognizable, which it can bounce off. Now, midway between the idea and the initial entrance of spirit into the approximation of a closure, that is the affective process, and we can write effect in the middle of this. Okay, so if we're having idea here, and I understand I'm drawing this upside down, but that's the way he's describing it. We could say that this is the idea realm here, and this is the conation there at this level. This part in the middle is the affection. The affective level, or literally the word affect comes from the old root in French, which means literally the influence, being aware of a very strong influence. So if you're affected, you're literally influenced by something. And it is still coming in towards here, we can write the final T on the end. And then the little circle with a dot in it, the idea itself as a point of precipitated energy and an orbital function around it. Every point, every existential point in the universe is surrounded by a field of force. That field is designed as a zone of influence. Every form influences every other form to some degree. Now, supposing we deliberately invert this for a moment and talk about the unconscious, the subconscious, and the nearly conscious, but not quite, the feeling process, and then gradually the formulation of an idea. We can write at the top, so he's inverting it now and he's saying, okay, we've got this here and we're going to do the idea here and we're going to approach that this way. So I'm drawing the same spiral that we had here, but that way round. We write at the top, we've got a pinned idea, we've inverted the diagram, it's still valid, except that it takes on somewhat of a modern psychological significance. In modern psychology, they have tried valiantly to get rid of the idea of spirit, because it implies a superior intelligence to that of the individual psychologists who are formulating the theory.
Who would that be?
I don't know. It probably...
It isn't Jung, it wasn't Bergson.
Well, probably Freud would be one of the people she's trying to indicate.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think what just the other...
It might be, yeah, but I never
Who's the one who's
I never
the-
got the impression that he thought he was superior intelligence to, you know.
To what he was analysing.
No, I never got the impression that that's what he was attempting to do.
Yeah.
I just think it's
It's interesting now because, of course, it's thought to be a very good idea, but actually completely unfounded on fact as far as Freud stuff. Freud stuff now. It's seen as a metaphor,
well,
which is...
Eugene practiced regression therapy,
Yeah.
which is Freudian. So, no.
Well, yeah, you could say it's Freudian, but you could also say it's exactly the same process in sort of analysing issues. It's more of a
No, I'm saying that's what Freud did.
Yeah.
For money, he regressed people
Yeah.
and said, the problem with you is something's happened in your childhood and we're going to examine it, bring it into the light of day. Which is what Eugene did.
Yep.
I just look at what looking for it.
No.
I just find the paragraph
Yeah.
strange because I mean I can see there are behaviourists, but I wouldn't call them psychologists in the sense that I'd call all these people. You know, so there seems to be people might get the impression he means clinical psychologists as opposed to
You mean like Skinner and
Yeah, I wouldn't call them clinical psychologists, would you? I would call them psychologists. What they do in universities now,
Yeah.
behaviourism.
Hmm.
And I just think that that's what she's referring to.
As opposed to the guys who the
As
talk
opposed to
you.
people
Yeah.
who were talking about,
Yeah.
people who needed help.
I suppose I thought first of all Freud for doing that, because in a sense he was putting himself, he was always describing the unconscious as being a limited sort of process, one that was, if you like, instinctive and animalish, which needed to be raised by human intelligence rather than the other way around, saying, well, actually there's a very significant function to these natural forces. So he seemed to be trying to, if you like, put reins on the beast, rather than saying, actually the beast is really quite intelligent.
Well, I think he was
when it
obsessed with presenting a scientific and limited view,
Yeah.
because he was terrified of being seen as...
Yeah.
So I think there's probably some way of looking at that, but I certainly wouldn't say it of Jung.
No.
In fact, Jung wrote books on the spirit.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it would be a slam dunk on the one hand to go, there's no such thing, but you wouldn't bother writing 2 books about it, would you? So I wouldn't think
No, that's
so
true.
either.
But
I think he means here, I think he means here,
the behaviourist, yeah.
which was, when Eugene was around, was very big.
Well,
you
certainly
know.
in the early 60s,
Yeah,
I was just thinking, yeah.
Yeah, it was it.
And it would have been Skinner at that particular time, and Eysenck and people, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and they were quite vehement.
Mm.
I mean, they still are.
Yeah.
You know, they refuse to look at any other data except the data that they can see,
Yeah.
which is just a position, isn't it?
And they don't recognise the value of processes which could be even, thinking of Skinner placed in animals, that there's no reference to the use of intelligence, you know, the fact that if you're a rat placed in a maze, then the processes which you go through, the way you respond, are quite an intelligent response to a very limited area. It's not the same thing as putting a rat in the wild and watching what they're capable of doing, you know, constantly outwitting sort of road officers and things, and finding ways through situations which are, you know, extremely intelligent responses to, traps and things which are set for them. So I think, and they tended to do that so that they could isolate them and make them look mechanical, like little tiny machines.
Or just all the way down materialistic.
Yeah.
And
And
that
then
was
say,
completely reductionist to
Yeah.
a neuron firing. So one-to-one correspondence, stimulus, no need for anything from you. They had a name for it, something neuron. They figured out that when somebody saw this, was it Jamie Anderson or somebody like that, that one particular neuron fired.
only one.
This went on for about 10 years, and then the whole lot was thrown out.
Yeah.
They don't know, this was,
That's-
apparently you would need more neurons than there are particles in the universe or something to do what we do.
It's
I
interesting.
suppose he was doing that.
It's interesting the way that these things seem to be very evidential and very formulated and completely accepted, and then you realise that they were actually...
I think it
actually
illustrates
very
as well
limited.
beautifully that Halliday was dealing with, not only was he introducing his view of things, but he was also dealing with the zeitgeist.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you know, just looking at it from that way, if you were in Liverpool in the 60s or whatever, and you're listening to Halliday talk about psychology, it just occurs to me here that that's one of those paragraphs where I go, you can locate it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes, and dealing with, although the ideas which he's bringing here and discussing with are very, very ancient ideas, as far as he's concerned, he wouldn't say they're his ideas, by the way.
Yeah.
We call them his ideas. He never did. He just said, this is the way it works. Have you got a better one? And of course, even when he analyses language, he's you know, he leaves us with the problem. Yes, if you check the etymology of all these things, it's highly possible. In fact, it fits all the description, including, I mean, this afternoon I looked at upsilon, and the generation for it and how it's used in the different language, have a look at it. Because it's called Y, because the Greeks used it, and it had a sound which we don't have, which is U. The French have U. We never use it in any words, but it's in museum. It should be museum, and mythos, it's that word there which we use a Y for. We play fast and loose with whether we use a Y or we use a U with an E behind it, but the Greeks used the one consistent letter, and the Romans didn't have it in their language, and they've twisted it in. So when you see the way it manipulates, it's quite legitimate to put an O in place of it, or a U, or even a Y.
And it's extraordinary that you saw it. I think that even if you're not quite sure about what it means because you don't know Greek, or you got to just go along with that, yes. But gynecology, you do know the word.
Yeah.
You're married, you've got kids, because you've heard it. And all of a sudden you go, these connections are actually there, aren't they?
Yeah.
And the way he actually keeps doing it, it's quite... I've never known anybody, even your good self, Alan, and you're good at it. Well, the way he does it, but it's unbelievable.
Because I used to listen, and I'd be knocked out. And then he jumps into Genevieve.
Yeah.
Which again, if you know the story of Arthur and Genevieve, you think to yourself, well, yeah, of course, where did that name come from? It's the two words put together, which he said that all these big words are little words welded together, joined together, to make a complicated, which means with folds. So you get a simple idea, which means simple, which means a seed form, P-L-E. Simple means a seed form, and you then complicate it, which means you fold it over and over again. So you get something and you fold it together and fold it together, and you make complex words out of very simple ideas. You're a true woman. So if you know that somebody's putting somebody in a story called True Woman, you can expect her to be representing some sort of an idea that an author has considered as very valuable about females. And then it ties in with this sort of mythology of description and how stories are based around that. I mean, for instance, that three-level being, you'll often find in fairy stories that there are three brothers or three sisters. And you think, one of them's impulsive, one of them's sensitive, a little bit more. The other one thinks clearly. Yeah, and the three Billy Goats Gruff.
And you don't feel you're being manipulated, do you?
No.
It's very strange listening to, I don't know, when you listen to a Halliday tape, you always go, how did he do that? Yeah, how did...
Yeah.
And I believe that had it been the night after, it wouldn't have been Guinevere. I don't know what it would have been, but he would have just come up with something else that would have been fitting just as well.
Yeah. And the other thing, I mean, it's just terrible. Yeah. So here we are talking about something we think is wonderful, but we do, because when you're doing a transcript, you think to yourself, listen to the sentences. They are very well produced sentences. I don't talk like that. I waffle and flap and go backwards and missay things and, all sorts of things. He hasn't. So it comes out very, very pure and very clear. And it comes out as if that it certainly does respond well to the fact that we're going slowly over it. We're on page 3 now, we've been talking for an hour. So in that sense, you can unpick an awful, it's so dense. I mean, I don't think we're going to get through it tonight. I hope you didn't think that we were. The reason why you've got it is because you can take it away and come back into it, because it will respond very well to your further thought processes. And he's now going to go from that into sort of astrophysics, in describing literally part of those processes and what the use of space is. So he's linking these together for us and saying it's all one process, whether you're talking about language or psychology or, creation, yeah. So this is being locked together in terms of, this is all the areas, all the words you know, and I'm pulling them together for you, because every now and again it's good to do this, because this multiplex of a universe that we have needs to be seen as a unity. It's the same process happening all over.
Would Guinness be essence of what?
Yes. In a particular way. Yeah. Well, he's saying that woman function there because she is a woman. What it actually means is the thing which starts literally to bring something into creation from nothing, out of nothing. So in that sense you could say it's more like that. The essence of that process here, the Gyna essence, isn't just woman, it's also that idea of gathering something of a nebulous amount of space and giving it shape and producing it into a thing that we can actually recognize and see. Because until it does that, that space remains unknown or unformed.
I'm sure goodness has produced lots of great ideas.
Yeah, and lots of children as well. Yeah. Now, if we consider this very carefully, we've abstracted just one conative being from an infinity of such beings. An infinity of possible beings subsists in the infinite power of the universal source, the Absolute. So he's calling what we would tend to call the Godhead, or the big G, or whatever. That field of possibilities he's calling the Absolute. And because it's a field of possibilities, he's saying what we're talking about is the way one of those possibilities comes into being in the material sense, or becomes a material body, whatever it is, whether it's a planet or a person or a sentence or a film or whatever, it comes into material existence by coming out of that no-place thing. That infinity, that power, can produce this cognitive process anywhere it likes. In other words, the qualities that we attribute to any part of space, we must logically allow for any other part of space. Space itself, as everybody knows, is not a material body. It is that in which material bodies subsist. Now, John's put a nice little laying out here. Space, spiritual force, undulation, sine wave, SP, posit point initiation of any centre whatsoever, H, HA, the infinite spirit. That's an analysis which John has actually laid down there for us. It's a way of understanding that word space. He's going to break it down now a bit. So if we write our word space down and examine it a moment and cut it, we find that it's made of ace, which is of course the symbol H. We see it in the French word for H, which of course is an English word ache. The idea of the ace function is the idea of spirit as infinite. But when we put the letter P in, we posit that there is something within that space relative to which we can conceive space as non-being. Force, a spiritual force, S, has posited itself within the infinite spirit. Okay, what he's saying there is, if we imagine, if you ignore the rest of the drawing except just that thing, this pure white paper is the space which is creating a dot, if you like, or a unit of something, a material dot. And to do it, it's actually drawing from itself energy which is being collapsed into that particular situation. It could produce that anywhere. It could focus anywhere in that whole vast field and produce that one dot. So that point here starts to become and start to look very much like what we're now calling non-locatable. A particle which comes as from a great non-locatable field. It could be anywhere possible and just condense in that place. We understand that better now that we've all got mobile phones, because we all exist in a certain non-locational space. If I go to the big Tesco's in Bidston with my dear wife, she could very easily get lost from me because I bumble about in places where she bumbles about different places. Can't find her at all, but the phone can. The phone rings her, it condenses literally on where she is. It's got a locational device inside it, which is field orientated. It's exactly the same process. So although there's a particle, that particular phone, the field which it actually located is bouncing off all sorts of, not Alpha Centauri, but it's bouncing off the ionoscope to actually find that woman who's literally 200 yards away from me, but I can't see her inside the big Tesco. So I can phone her up and I use that non-locatable zoning influence to find out just exactly where she is. There's a field operation that finds her much easier than I can, and I'd have to shout, embarrass myself. So I used to quote. It's quite easy. Now that idea in modern physics is quite a, it's only about 80, 90 years old, the fact that we recognize that energy particles, and remember all those things which this tangible world is made up of, are force fields. They're fields of force which create particles which are very tight movements. They're only, again, movements of energy. They don't become material things at any point in their existence. And we know this because when you slam them together in terms of nuclear power, they explode at vast amounts and all the energy releases. So we know that there's a tremendous amount of energy bound up in them, but it is only still moving in that place. It's the same energy tightly fastened in and held into a shape which it's repeating over and over again constantly. So it's still nothing moving but tightly, so that it becomes resistant to all other forces and things like that. Does that make sense? Okay. Seem to be a wonderful explainer tonight. I don't usually get this success. Okay, so he's then going to say that word ace. We'll change the diagram a bit and we'll write P for potted here. That might be the finger of God, or it might be a paramour pointing downwards. He's being rather rude here. He's saying that letter P is a positor. It actually is that function of positing, of putting something here in the field. And when it's doing that, it's the positing action of dropping something into place. Right, where am I? Sorry, I've lost my place.
Bottom of page 3.
That's it. But all around this P, or place, or posited being, there's an infinity of spirit which is represented by the ace. In a pack of cards we have ace high and ace low. Ace high theologically corresponds with the absolute Godhead, superior to the king. Ace low counts as the primary particle in the universe, the first precipitate of that spirit. Ace low is immanent in manifest being, in positive form, and ace high is transcendent, absolutely, infinite field. So this is a very interesting image, if you like. Again, it's metaphorical, but you can see the wonderful use of the thing ace in cards, which can either be very high or very low in its function. I always thought it linked the whole little mini kingly realm of a pack of cards by making the top into the bottom and the bottom into the top, of course. But it also makes a reference to the fact that it is both placement and space at the same time. So this same word H has two significance. It's the infinite field, ace high. It's also the immanent energy in any positive form. So if you like to take the first letter of spirit, SP, the reason we do is because the S means an undulation, and the motion of the sphere can be analysed out like a sine wave. And because the S means, and this is the same function going across all these concentric ripples that posit a P. So what he's saying again, he's using again a letter and saying it's an engineering term. It is an undulating energy. It's describing an undulating energy like that. And that is a description in time of a circulating energy. If you have an energy which is circulating like that, and then you time it, you draw it in a time situation, or if it's going up and down like this, recording something, and you have moving paper behind it, it will draw a sine wave. So that is that swinging backwards and forwards process, literally in time, as time moves along. So the undulating energy is a circulating process which is being recorded in time. When I used to be a school teacher, we had a seismograph which is literally records the movements of the planet, literally any particular process of movement. And along the side it used to have rolls of paper, and you could never see the damn thing moving, but when you wound them back you could see that it had actually drawn vibrations, and it was actually catching and drawing undulations like that as it received the energy on the end of this long arm that was vibrating with the tiny little movements of the geological structure. So when we draw something like that, we're actually representing that same circulating energy, the orbital energy, pushed through time. Okay. Now we've been going for about an hour and a quarter. Do you think it's about time that we could have a break in about 10 minutes, Fee?
10 minutes.
Well, sure.
Yep.
Okay. Is that all right with everybody?
I can't put the kettle on.
It's, I don't know whether it's dense or I'm dense, but actually it's, we're moving slowly, but I think we have to move at this pace to actually cover what he's saying.
I'll say, I think the group things, this is where the group situation really works. I think you tried this on your own,
Yeah.
no disrespect to us all. It's a lot harder.
It is.
You know.
It is. And I'm sure that when it was first said, most of the people wouldn't have got most of what was going on, that was being said.
How long did it take you, John, to just do the transcription?
Well, the typing speed is quite slow.
Yeah.
So well, we get the whole lot done in about 12 hours.
Everybody has the same experience.
And then
That
I go through
you're
it.
really going at it,
Yeah.
and it still takes you ages. What did he say now?
Yeah.
A minute, let's go back.
That's very good. I take about 30 hours.
Yeah.
30 hours to do
I
it.
take more than 12, but John's done more than any
No,
of them.
that 12 is the initial.
All right.
I've got to go back over it and see all the mistakes I've made and
Yeah.
then tidy it up.
Yeah. And the reason we do this is because, well, I particularly have not found anybody who relates so many things together in such a clear way. In this process, he keeps coming back to these symbols. Once you, I mean, if this is the first time you've seen them, then I understand it must be terribly confusing, especially when somebody puts it up like that. But when you've heard them again and again, they start to actually work on you, and you understand, particularly that three-part being. If you actually understand those levels, then when someone talks about the chakras, and all they're doing really is putting a top here, one there, which has already been described, one here, one there, and one there. Then they're actually separating, if you like, those planes, putting one in the centre, there's one in there too as well, top and bottom. So you've got those three processes. The frontiers where they meet, and here particularly you've got a quite distinct separation. You haven't got a distinct separation here, which is marked in that diagram the way he puts it. And so you've got literally the levels with these three things, which are directly experienceable. We've all felt a desire, which is like an action, and literally a conative drive. We've all felt that something we've got to do without any particularly feeling or wanting to do it. You know, these processes like hunger and stuff, which drives us. You can actually see somebody forcing food down while they're trying to do something else. It's as if this drive will not be denied, even though they wanted to finish off this job or do the job. But their body doing it at the same time. It's remarkable to watch. So we've all got those. We've all felt tremendous emotional charges, which are essentially positive or negative. We've got qualifications to them. We'd say there's nostalgia, which can be extremely moved, but we can also say, in terms of a nostalgia, still, yes, it's nostalgia, but I like this one, or it's nostalgia and it's very destructive. It's actually holding me in a situation which I should be getting rid of. So we can feel the positive and negative within the qualifications of the way we describe it. And of course, we're all aware of thought processes, images, words, formulations inside our head constantly. So those three chakras, if you like, are nailed down for us by him, and then the hinterland between them, where there's battles going on. Literally the larynx, where there's a great deal of battle going on between form and feeling centres, and the diaphragm, which is again the stomach area, where a great people have a great deal of tension, where the feeling level, nature and that desire nature are constantly battling. These top and bottom ones are references to the world that we live in. That's one which is supposed to be a solar one, and this is one as an earth one. So people are constantly saying, if you go to New Age centres, New Age circles, ground yourself, actually feel yourself to be part of the earth, or literally, you know, feel yourself outwards and go into the field around out of which you've come and which you are surrounded by. So those levels he's already nailed down for us to understand experientially. He'll go into these different things. This is the vocalizing one, which is actually using all these words here to formulate that in order so that we can stabilize our feeling nature as well. So the language helps us to use this level to help formulate and stabilize our feelings, which can be very much turbulated by our responses to the way the species things drive us. We have needs that we have in this world which we feel are absolutely important. When you find somebody doing something intense, you know, like or struggling to make a living, you usually find that one of the forces which is driving them is either status, appetite, or sexual drive. There's those things which they want to be above everybody else if possible, for some reason, whatever it is. Or they're looking for a mate, they want somebody to actually relate sexually to. Or there was a friend of mine used to say, it's my bread and butter, this is my bloody bread and butter. He meant actually a lot more than bread and butter, because he drove a Porsche. But he actually said, this is bread and butter to me. So we tend to think of it in terms of those things. But the processes that they knot us into, the trouble those things get us into, and the way that we have to respond, and how literally our feeling states react to that, and then our thought processes, is the flux of life. He's describing it pretty well for us. And he's saying that our people who are stressed here, you've dealt with them, you've met them, they don't worry about things, they're quite direct, they know what they want, and they want it. And if they don't want it, they're asleep. And people here who are feeling based, they tend to produce things of a sensitive nature, they tend to be more feeling orientated. In that, it's important to them the response level that they get and how they affect people. And the people here who literally have detail, structure, they want to know exactly how everything fits together, what its place is, how much of it they need, and will it be there exactly on the time they said it would be. These people don't care about that, and those people have no interest at all, as long as they finish it winning. So we know people like that. He would also say, because he would say there's a sword that goes through all of those, and there is some people who understand all those processes and can organize them and link them together. And that's what you would best be. You don't want to get rid of that, you don't want to get rid of that, you don't want to get rid of that. You want to relate them or yoke them all together, which he would say is the function of yoga. Yoke them all together so that you can use them all but not be used by any of them. So you don't have to think if there's nothing to think about. You know, some situations don't require thought. You can overthink a situation just as much as you can underthink it. You know, you can overdrive into a situation just as much as you can drive into it, and you can overfeel things. These things need to be related together. You really need to respond to them in the right way. And those work very well in stories. Right. So, what he's talking about here is this human response at...
Yeah.
Great. Should we have a little break? There's tea and coffee in the kitchen, and we'll break for about 20 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you.
It's interesting. There's two boundaries.
Do a riff on a while.
Yeah.
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 Sat.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah. That's why I think it's important that he enters that the psychology into our bodies, because often the first thing that you notice is you start to not be very difficult you start to say,
Yeah.
the way they say that, the way they turn,
Yeah.
and that makes you more sensitive to the fact that you are.
But it is.
Yes.
When I read
Language to really accelerate it changes
they actually
and the very thoughts.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
see with, you know, the young people
Yeah.
radio.
Yeah.
Why-
Did you listen to you?
I'll mention that when we come back, that is
Yeah.
really an important aspect.
Yeah.
I used to follow my
Yeah.
mother from university and she immediately showed us
Yeah.
what's happening.
I can only take in a small
Yeah.
bit at a time.
Yeah.
Reading through all that
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can tell the way the baby starts. You hear the mother say, oh no, they're just swallowing,
Yeah.
swallowing, drizzling. They don't really need it.
and maybe it's just it's rather less. I mean, I've read it, but this is the formula for all that, which is why I'm guessing I suggested that even that one talk could be used to talk about Guinevere and another talk that had to be somebody else.
No,
It doesn't matter. The news take the house, so all he has to do is
I've done it.
well, supposed to there at Sunderland on Tuesday.
Maybe using something I don't know.
Walking. We did end up in one of the
That's
pubs.
the way I'm thinking of it down to
Yeah.
I've only
I just find that interesting because it seems almost like
Yeah.
a lot of people do.
And I mean, in many senses, I mean, you hear it now,
Yeah, that's what I'm
you know, the language, it's quite sexist in
when
a sense.
they create these
I
little
think the
small
language
things
was-
on there,
Yeah.
and it just seems like trickery. I understand it's trickery, but that's the way
Yeah.
it's looking things it up
That's
as.
right.
Wow.
brain needs to see that.
My brain.
Great spaces and nothing to do with
Philosophical.
this.
Tea is being
Okay,
served.
let's get some.
It's his own pattern of thinking.
Look at it. It's like
Are you getting on? Are you okay with it?
Yeah.
No.
Enjoying it?
I'm enjoying it, but okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
please kick it to death and argue anybody.
I was asking a question, but I think listening is
And you
a
listen,
good
yeah,
point.
it's so
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, I use it too. Totally different to any other system.
Somebody's in there.
Yeah, that's
There's
right.
another one upstairs if you want to turn
What philosophical
right down there.
counsel was he bringing in specific?
But he
He just had the simple motif, didn't he? That he applied to everything.
yeah. How do you mean motif?
Yeah. Well, the KO. What is it? N motif probably describes all all manifestations of nature. I'm saying probably because I've got no idea, but I think that's what it comes across like he had. He just had it's almost like he had the simple on,
Yes.
and so all he had all of it, so all he had to do was apply it to everything, and because it was I only call it a motif because I don't know what other word to use.
Well, the interesting that you should mention that you chucked it off some of it.
Yeah, I've done actually.
You start off with a free sort of sound. It's totally open. And at the end of it, you close the mouth and you feel the whole being vibrating with that sound. It's very powerful.
When it brings Buddhism on our own as body, speech and reality.
Yeah.
Body, speech and reality.
Yeah. Well, the R is totally free. It's the alpha. At the beginning of every alphabet is the R. It's no restriction. restriction there. It's just
Yeah.
free. And then the O, the O is already starting to formulate. And then it's closing completely. And sometimes some methods have it be from the M, you then go to the letter N. So you close the mouth on the left with the M,
Yeah.
and then you lift the tongue to the roof of the mouth,
Brilliant.
to the end, yes. Ow. And then the final thing is, imagine you're pronouncing all four of those simultaneously. That's the mystical method, which is quite, that's powerful as well. Trying to imagine all four of them at the same time.
When you were talking about the energy coming central, I'm talking about the fact that nothing is actually there because it's all just particles. Nothing that atoms, nothing.
Even the atoms themselves are a space.
Yeah, that's why I
Space
think
in
again,
motion.
I'm thinking along the lines of, the emptiness when you go into Buddhism, emptiness,
Emptiness.
de-risk, and I thought it was like coming down to emptiness, because that's really hard to sort of get on board. Theoretically, yes, but I spoke to a few people, because I go to Pigam as well, I've been for many years, after a few people. And when you're talking, a monk was really good 10 days, 4-year retreat. He was there for 9 years before, took off 4-year retreats, similar, he started off in Scotland, and then the place he was at went to Germany, and people just brought him through to his house. And I did say to him when he got back, I said, depending on walking into city life, when you've got total, it must hit you so hard. And I thought, when he brings everything back, because some of the other teachers do keep basically to the delusions, the 6 delusions and how they
Okay, so just a couple of points before we start off. When we said here about these are the 2 points of, these are the points of problems with your environment, if you like, with this with the earthly one and that with the solar one, these are considered to be areas of problems between the different zones of our being. And Karen just pointed out about, this larynx one is one which immediately tells you the tone and the comfort level of people. If you're listening to the quality of their voice, you're actually getting that relationship there. Or if you feel the lack of relationship, where the feelings are not being represented properly and not being expressed with the words that they're saying, you can feel the tremulation that actually happens in the larynx very powerfully. You can also feel, to a degree, the motive which is wrapped in. Halliday used to say to me, listen to the adverts on the TV. Listen to the way they try and pull you. Most of the words have got a hook on the end of them. It's like, he said, it was like you watch a cat's tail. If it wants somebody, if it wants a prey, its tail will go flat out, and at the end it will just hook over like this. And he said that if you watch it with a bird, the bird will get caught on the tail, and it will forget that it's got teeth at the other end, and it's watching the tail while the cat is getting into position. He said exactly the same thing with the way they do that. The words will come out, and they'll be smooth, and there'll be a pull on the end of it. And I remember I used to, when I was a student, one of the lecturers used to have that. She used to say my name in such a way that it had a hook on the end. She'd say, Alan. You can feel the pull, literally. And it was, I used to think, what's going on here? The sound was, it had a curl on the end of it, just like that lick. So the feelings come across through that larynx thing. So if there's a battle going on between your feeling state and the way you formulated your idea, the larynx will give that away. And here it's exactly the same between the feeling and the drive into a situation. So we can expect problems. These will be the areas of problems of emotional disturbances with thoughts and with drive situations, according to the way the diagram has been expressed. Of course, you get problems with all parts of your body. Halliday would also say, and this is fascinating when you see it, he would say, okay, so this is the way the body organizes itself. Prime drive, differentiation, analysis. Okay? You do the five senses appear as being referenced. Okay? 5 senses is analysis, differentiation into plus and minus. I like it there. There's like prime drive. And then he says, okay. So it's also here. That's the prime drive of the arm. 1 bone, 2 bones, which gives you the ability to do that. I'll have it. I won't have it. Don't want it, thank you. And the analysis, the 5-fold analysis at the end. Same with the legs. So that this replication, and he said, this isn't just in human beings. And it isn't just in mammals. It's a process which seems to work efficiently and very functionally in most living things. And it's certainly true that we've developed along that evolutionary chain. But you can find those processes in bats, in elephants, in whales, those analysis of those limb structures. And so it does look like it's really quite a powerful universal structure of the way that analysis formulates itself. He said it's even in plants. You've got the roots here, which are to do with the relationship to the environment. You've got the leaves, which are to do with the relationship, the feeling, if you like, level relationship with the atmosphere, taking in processes, the plus and minus of in-breath and out-breath, and you've got literally the flower or the seed head here, the process, the thing that this thing produces in itself to replicate into the next generation, and the processes like that. So that's the flowering level of ourself. It's the leaf, and the spine is like the stem, and the root thing here, where you literally analyze. You've got these very great rooty looking lumps of tissue down here, which analyze the great chemistry. You know, you've got chemistry going on in here, which, as he said to me once, if some of that chemistry dropped on your hand, you'd have minutes to get it off, you know, because it would just burn right through. And it's inside here. Very complex and industrial levels of analysis, breakdown of chemistry going on inside there. You know, tremendous gases being released and acids being produced, and, you know, breaking things down. He said human beings can. Literally, if you chew it well, you can analyze bone, you can break down bone tissue and stuff like that down there. It really is very basic, fundamental industrial processes going on down there. So that's the engine room, you know. These are the sails and billows, and this is literally the fundamentally analysis on what we produce from it, the head, the heart, and the belly. It's a pretty good description of a violin or a guitar as well, because he was saying that's why they were considered to be true instruments. The violin means the true instrument, because it reflects the human condition. And the tension between the head and the belly is where you actually get the force, the actual sound, the tuning, if you like, of that tension is what gives the meaning to the value of the vibration of the string. So it's to do with literally the tension produced between society's rules inside for most people and how you know, what your body wants you to do, and the tension that produces creates this feeling level here where you get most of the resonance. It's a fascinating analysis which I'd never seen anyone else ever do and take it into so many different areas. But he did. Right. So that was one question, which I think relates quite simply to how we feel ourselves and how we experience ourselves. Martin was asking about this space and the ace high and the ace low business, and I think it's about to come out in the next couple of paragraphs. So we'll go through it, and then if I can explain any more or add any more to it, then I will. Okay? So I'm at the top of page 4, just after where it says ace high is transcendent absolutely. So the same word H has two significance. It's the infinite field, ace high, It is also the immanent energy in any posited form. So you know that God's always represented as the transcendent, the one beyond the individual, and also immanent, the one inside the individual. So if that whole field, the spirit, as we said before, has produced an individual form, it hasn't actually blackened out all the spirit. There's still some white paper in there. That would be the immanent spirit trapped inside the individual. And the whole field is the transcendent spirit, transcendent meaning the beyond the individual. That is the spirit that links this individual with every other individual in the planet. And the part inside of you, the essence of you, the conscious centre inside of you, I would say, is the same as every conscious centre in everybody else, but individualised and characterised by literally the processes that you've been through. In other words, you have memory forms, you have literally an understanding which separates you from the person next to you on the bus only in terms of the forms which you've experienced and been through. There's no difference other than that, essentially. That's why people say, there but for the grace of God go I. In other words, the other guy has just literally been processed, bashed around in a different way to me. That's why he's like that.
Yeah, they call it the Brahman and the Atman, don't they, in Oriental terms?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's purely it, and that's also what we would class as the soul, which is the way it was first of all translated, way back when we first started to talk about Indian terms, and so that's a good way of thinking about it, and the great beyond, the thing that the difference between us and that is here the question of magnitude and the complexity of the relationships that thing can contain. So, if you like to take the first letter of spirit, S, and P, the reason we do is because the S means undulation, and the motion of a sphere, that's why I said, if you make that circular thing, and you imagine something's going round, and then you say, well, actually, it's not going round and repeating itself in the same place, if you like, in terms of time, because time is moving along. So every time it rotates, it's actually doing that. Can you see what I mean? Because if something's circulating and time is going past it, it's actually going through time like that. It's worming its way through, So you can imagine if we see the sun, the Earth going around the sun, for instance, it's going around the sun, but the sun itself is moving. So the Earth isn't circulating in the universe. It's worming its way through the universe. It's never in the same space twice, unless, as one or two people say, the ancients actually recognised that it's actually the sun itself is circulating around something as well, and that is circulating around something. So there's great cosmic movement through the whole universe. It isn't a static thing. We tend to think of it as static, and we see the representations like that, but it's actually worming its way through the universe like that. And it's a solid thing. If you looked at it over a time perspective, you see those photographs of car lights going through New York or something, and you see them as continuous weave patterns and stuff. If you could see that with the planets, they'd actually be weaving a pattern as they go right through the universe, which is constantly changing. It's one of those sine waves like that, processes all weaving into and out of each other. Because the S means undulation, and the motion of the sphere can be analysed out like a sine wave and considered as an undulation. This same function is going across all these concentric ripples and to posit that P. So in that process, it's actually saying that this thing here is actually positing. It's again an engineering type diagram of a process which is pushing a thing into that particular place. He would also say that just about every, certainly all the Romance languages, but most languages, as far as I heard him say, the references for father are to do with P, T, R. Now, the P becomes F, but the T and the R tenses remains constant, and he would say that's because in every language, the father is the one who represents literally the thing that puts you there. He puts you there. And that positing and that TR root is the root of all references to a rotor. And all the root words which he says are to do with that rotor. Remember we said if we only recognize something that repeats, that constantly repeats itself, we can then see that it tends to behave in a particular pattern. We recognize the pattern. That pattern we see as being a law, like that, L-O-R-E. If it stays like that, we say it's a law with a W and nail it down. It becomes fixed. All the old words for that are to do with T and R. Rota, Torah. You even say that Tao was actually said like that, because there's an aspirant at the end of it. Taro. He said what they're all talking about is this great roll of situations where the universe creates itself out of something which circulates, repeats, and is then, because it repeats, it's recognizable. It's got that cognizance that we talked about before. We can see relationships coming back again as we've seen them before. And we recognize them and we recognize literally, there's a pattern to this. I can formulate it. When I know the formulation of that, then I can actually use it to control people, is one of the basic analysis he would say. Most of the priesthoods used a regulation and an organization of time in terms of seasons, etc., to control the populace. This was true in Egypt. We know that at the bottom of the pyramids they actually had little cellars which were dug down into the river, because in Egypt you've got the actual mountains where it rains are several hundred miles away from where the actual river Nile floods. So if you go down into the cellars and dig a very sloping floor, then what you can do, if it slopes very, very intensely, the priest would come down the steps and he would check, literally he would measure where the Nile was. Because the floods, which were hundreds of miles away, would happen at a particular time of year, but not the same every year. And he would actually, because that would be emphasized by literally that gradation along there, a tiny movement, a tiny rise in the River Nile would be reflected along these points very distinctly. So as soon as it started to move, he would go up to the top and say, the Nile is going to flood. We know the Nile is going to flood. Get yourself ready, because of course they had to dig all sorts of canals to capture the water. If the canals weren't dug in the right time, then it wouldn't flood properly. And upon that rested their power. They were able to calculate that, and they were able to calculate the seasons to an infinitely precise configuration. Stonehenge is used in exactly the same way. It's actually a big cosmic calculator. It doesn't just point to the summer solstice, which is what they point out, but the horseshoe stones also point for when the lunar calendar corresponds with the sidereal calendar, with the sun calendar, which they also calculated by the placement of stones. So it means you can get people and say, well, next Saturday if you stand here, it will actually, the sun will come down and it'll stay on that particular point, and the moon will be pointing on that one over there. So regular was this cyclical law that they'd embodied into their stones, that they could use it to predict things, and if you were of a persuadable type of fancy, they could easily convince you that they had a great deal of information. Now it's taken years and years before they could have been able to calculate those things and predict them to such a clear and precise degree. But we are finding now more and more that these ancient monuments are actually used as planetary alignments. The only way to explain what they're there for, because they wouldn't be as precise as they are. So we know that these sorts of regulation measurements and things like that were codified into the system and used to create governments and to establish governments as being the ones that actually controlled fertility and the ones that control production. it would appear. These things are buried in the stories of the Bible, like the story of Joseph and the weeds of corn and the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years, etc. And Pharaoh says to him, "You're so intelligent, Joseph, I'll make you as Pharaoh, second only to me in the whole of Egypt." Because what he did was, when they had a lot of stuff, he took it off them and he put it in silos, and when they didn't have anything, he sold it back to them for their own land. If you read the story, it's a very crafty trick to do. What it meant was, they gave you, in taxation, the food that could be stored, which is grain, and then when times got hard, you sold them their own grain back and you bought their land from them. So you then disenfranchised them completely, and they became your serfs. Not slaves, but serfs in that sense. So they had to work for you then for their own goods.
This apparently is a good thing.
Certainly good for Pharaoh. And Joseph does it with his own brothers, remember, because they come to get grain because they're herding folk. So it was a very effective way of government, apparently, according to the Old Testament. It does actually, make you think about the stories that the vicar used to tell you, or that they put in storybooks. Right, sorry, back to the plot. If you drop a pebble on the surface of water, that water itself will behave in this rippling manner. We saw some large iron girders with ripples on them on the way up tonight. How they got in is a mystery, but they were very well done. The essential of this undulation is that by its very nature, an undulation is the infinite continuum. In the infinite continuum, always produces points of precipitation, because this undulation going through is continuously stimulating the whole field and causing a process of feedback, a back motive force, a back EMF if you like. As soon as we discharge energy from a point, the field always reacts back onto the point from which the motion is initiated. So we'll write the letter P for this point of initiation, for the positing of any centre, whatever. Right, this piece is getting a little bit intense. I'll get rid of this one. And I'll say, what he's talking about here is that positing force is like a pebble which is dropped onto a wave, and as it does that, the force itself strikes out at the field. And in that way, what's happening is this field, or this body of water, is pushing back against the energy which is hitting out. So it's very similar to that diagram of the spinning in like this, hitting the place. The resistance, if you like, of that force hitting it is literally the field energies pushing back against any force which is pushing out. At a certain point, that level, they'll balance themselves out and they'll hold a sense of beingness, if you like. Where did I put that? Oh. So this point of initiation and that intensity is feeling the resistance of the whole infinite field, or that infinite body of water responding back onto that. So the whole field is just where it says zones of rotation. We'll write out a P on this point of initiation for the positing of any centre whatsoever. So the whole field is considered as H, or ace, or spirit. And the product of the motion, the absolute motion of this field at any point whatever throughout space, is the positing to the self-interference of this motion pattern, the positing of a point. So if we imagine that also we've got this substantial field, if you like, responding, and the point of initiation, because of course in the infinite field we're describing the fact that not a pebble dropping, but literally the field intensely bashing itself at that point by coming together and clashing rather than one object dropping on another. But the effect is using that water to describe how it would react. we're feeling something which is clasping itself, and also something which is in the centre which is resisting and pushing out. So you get an intense point of existence, or if you like, an orbital zone around it where the push out is equal to the push in. In biblical terms, he said that's what they call the firmament. It's that which is bashed out from inside and outside at the same time. And that is your being. You've pushed into the world as far as you can, and you've done that in terms of how the world is bashed back at you. So you've been contained, resisted by the world to some degree. You haven't been able to completely get your own way and dominate a situation. You've been resisted on all sides by your parents, your siblings, the world around you, your classmates, the people that work with you, because you would, in that sense, wish your will to be law in the cosmos. Everybody does. And the only resistance to that is all the other people who want their will to be law in the cosmos as well. If carrots had their way, Eugene used to say, the only thing you'd be able to grow would be carrots. They want to take over the world. He said, the only thing that stops them is all the other bloody plants and the human beings and the creatures that eat them. This is the way the world is. So we think, that we've defined ourselves pretty well, but we've defined ourselves along with the world. The world has pushed us back as far as it can push us. And at a certain point we rebel again. We won't allow it to be pushed any further back. So we define ourselves in interaction with the universe in that sense.
If rabbits bred and none of them got killed,
Yeah.
at the end of a year, they'd be propagating through space faster than the speed of light.
I want to see the maths for that, Bob. I'm sorry, I want to see the
I've
maths.
seen this. I've had no, I can't. But apparently that is right. What a
It's
wonderful
amazing.
picture.
Oh dear. Right, I've lost my thread now. Yeah, I see all these rabbits. Never mind. Yes. Right, so the whole field is considered throughout space is this positing through the self-interference of this motion pattern. In other words, the field is both sides. It's you and the thing pushing back against you, because the field has created all those beings that are opposing you as well. So it's self-opposition at the field level. We've said before, if you charge two forces across each other, at the point of intersection here, they rotate. If we say that let that represent one pencil and that is another pencil, he's actually holding two forces together, or two pencils, and he's imagining that if you push them together, and you push really intensely, because of the inequality, literally, they won't meet perfectly, they will tend to constantly rotate around each other and slip, in that sense. If you hold them, put the tips together and push hard, you will find it extremely difficult. If you use a lot of force, practically impossible to stop those pencils spinning around each other. To try to get two pencils, put the end together and press them and keep them in line, you'll find it is very difficult. And in the same way as the difficulty is for a human being, so it is for the absolute. The reason is quite simple, that when you release energy from your nervous system, the energy is quantized, and therefore it's always too much or too little to balance exactly, so it vibrates. And you can't stop this vibration, and therefore the tendency is for the pencils, when you press them, to displace themselves and skid off. And once the motion has started in a rotating manner, the inertia of it tends to continue. So if you try to press pencil ends together, press hard, they slip. If you try to line them up, they tend to slip again. And in the opposition, you develop a rotation. So with the absolute field, any intersecting forces develop a zone of rotation. Now let's go back to our cone diagram again. The infinite field represented by the paper represents H. We borrow the word paper from the Egyptian word, which means your father is reasonable, anglicized as papyrus. Again, he's analysing the words just in fun as he goes past. And the idea is you can always trust spirit. And this you can certainly do, providing that the spirit you are trusting is absolute. And if ever the spirit that you're trusting is finited, because don't forget, inside that circle is a finited spirit. Inside there is spirit, but it's finited. So those spirit in there cannot always be trusted. It isn't infinite. It's got an axe to grind, as you have. It's got a body, it's got desires, a species driven. It's got feelings of like and dislike. It's got ideas which have been put into it by its parent. So it cannot be trusted in the same sense as the free spirit, which has got no conditioning upon it at all. So you say, when someone says you can always trust spirit, you've got to remember which spirit you can trust. If you're getting it straight from the source, yes. But if some human being is telling it you, like I'm telling it you now, you cannot trust it. You have to literally consider and take it into yourself and see whether it's working for you in situations, and then try and see if it works in the world. And if ever the spirit you're trusting is finited, then you're better to distrust it. That is, to have two kinds of trust, one from the will and one from the understanding. So in other words, the word distrust is two kinds of trust. You think it through and you feel, from the drive, what's being pushed here. Like when you listen to your own lyrics and you hear, what are they actually saying? They're telling me that Oma lights brightness, but what's actually the feeling behind it all, So here we are with this reappearance of the cone again. From the infinite, the energy winds in. This winding is now an abstraction out of the total function of infinite power. Once it's begun to turn in, it feels, in the turning in, itself to come to consciousness of its own process, progressively sharper and sharper, until when it gets right down to its limiting closure, it has become completely aware of itself. Now you know that in Zen, Japanese Buddhism, or is it Zen Buddhist Japanesism, I'm not quite which way round it is, the basic idea is, what is my original face before I appeared in the time process? Let's just see what this means. And John's put down here the characterization of that from the Zen text, was it, John?
Which?
Yeah, the footnote at the bottom.
Oh, Zen, yes.
Yeah. That's not Halliday's reference, that's John putting in. Referencing that particular story that he's actually talking about. Let's see what this means. So, in other words, when they say in Zen Buddhism, what was your original face before you were born, actually, is what they say. So, before even your parents were born, is actually said in John's quote. They're actually saying to you, what were you like before you started to wind into this process? And does it have any meaning? What sort of meaning does a question like that have? It has a certain quality. Some people would say, well, it's got pretty no meaning, because without any characterization, what could that possibly be? So he's going to tackle that now. Are there any thoughts about where we are so far? Does everybody feel they've got where we are? Is it okay? Nothing you'd like to say, or any visions? Yeah.
Yeah, just with the way, again, like as before, the way he breaks down the word space to explain the process. I mean, it just seems very arbitrary. It's just, is it a playful thing, or are we supposed to infer more solid meaning from it?
He would put more solid meaning into it because he uses it several times. Now, SP, he would say, he would tend to call this sentience, which is consciousness, and spirit. So he would use all those words as being synonymous, not because they are linguistically, but he always used them the same. For him, the field...
Purely because those letters are in that word?
No. That letters, in that sense, in every word, he would analyse as being that.
And is there any etymology behind that?
There is, in that this letter here is meant to represent the etymology for the S. Let me go through it.
Is it even called etymology when he's talking about the shapes of...
It's beyond etymology, because etymology takes you down as far as syllables, literally. To go beneath that is something which Halliday does.
Alphabet, so.
Yeah, but he would say no. It's they're based on literally the Sumerian and the Egyptian letters.
Were they pictorial?
Yes, they were hieroglyphs, and they were meant to represent particular objects and things. Now that one particularly, I can't reference up at the moment, other than the fact that he always drew it as a snake on its side.
So
he said it,
he's not just being new agey and making up these words what he feels.
No, he isn't. And I'll have to look that one up again for you and come back to it. But he always used to draw it like that. And he said it's literally the issuance. It's something which is issuing and everything. And it is the drawing of a sine wave, which is also an M and an N.
Well, I can accept it more if it's coming from a
Yeah.
lineage.
Okay.
I'll have
The P is the positing, and he would say it's actually a drawing, if you look at it, of a male organ, not actually positing in that particular thing. But F and P were often referenced like that, and that is what the hieroglyph is if you go back to the Egyptian. Okay? So it's positing, so when he says that's the father, and Papyrus, he's actually saying, he's referencing it to that. Now, the ace thing is that letter H.
I didn't understand how you get H out of ace.
Well, he does it. He takes it back quite simply, and he uses the language in terms of what it says. I think he references French, doesn't he?
Are you more concerned about whether or not it would apply to all of us if we were researching
Oh, I've got it now.
words, or whether or not it's a little more existential and it's his viewpoint? Because somebody who knew him in the 40s claims that, Donald Lord, claimed that Eugene came to say that he discovered a way of analysing words, and that apparently, according to the story goes from this guy, that he wrote all this down. When he'd finished doing it, he burnt it and said to Donald Lord, and Donald Lord protested. He said, well, it's no good to you, because you would have to find all this out for yourself. In other words, it was experiential, Eugene Halliday, and you can't just go, well, there's 26 letters, and there's a list of what they mean, and so there, I've saved you like a load of things, you don't have to do this. And I think a lot of people have this difficulty with the way he approaches language. He'd say, I believe, which means I think it's true, that he experienced the written word. I'm not sure about the spoken word, but I think he was. I think it was actually the spoken word, but I couldn't demonstrate that because it's not in any of the text. But I think this is like a grimoire or some form of hermeneutic explanation, and what we hear when he's talking is him going through his processes of clarifying them in the arbitrariness of a general language. So like there's a possibility, if you like, you understanding what he says, but I just appreciate the difficulties exactly. It doesn't work for me, frankly. There are some things I sort of do, but I've never heard anybody do anything like this and tie it all together in quite that way that he does.
He said to me that he got it from Jacob Boehme, who says that Jacob Boehme is a Protestant mystic, sort of, I can't spell Boehme.
Boehm.
H-M-E. Boehme, roughly contemporary with Shakespeare as I recall, in my vagueness. And he said there was something called a Natursprache, which means nature speech, which is mentioned in the Bible as being pre-Babel, that all human beings speak the same language, which was a sound system. It was literally like a mantra. They toned the same way, and that they literally could understand each other because the words came as a step down from that. So first of all, they sang, they made songs, they toned, in other words, And he said, what you've got with the letters, you've got vowel sounds which come out of your vowels. They're vowel sounds, which means they're tones. And you can sing them. And then you've got consonants, which are traps that your larynx and your vocal cords and your teeth and your tongue put on those vowel sounds. So he said the vowel sounds are quite simple to analyse. They're A, E, I, O, U, and they're scaled, and they fit on that body from most contracted to least contracted, and that means literally the size of the aperture that you say them through. And he said if you do them from the bottom upwards, and these would be the European vowels, not the English ones, which are diphthongs. We've twisted our vocalization. You have to go to the Spanish or the Italian vowels, which you can sing because they're pure tones. He would say that's ooh, or we would tend to say. This one is oh, ah, e. And if you hear it like that, you're contracting the orifice that you're sounding the vowel through, from oo, o, a, e, I. You're making a more tighter contraction, which is what you're doing up here with it. The consonants are then blocking that in particular ways, either on the teeth, as with the dentines, with t and d, or with the tongue, or with the labials, which here like b and v and f. All those are done with these little productions, and they're either voiced with vowels or not voiced with breath. And if you're producing them not breath, you would say, this is a long convoluted thing, you're saying them with H, which is pure breath. Pure breath is pure spirit, it's ace in all the languages, or H. It's also pure, unvoiced, breathing beingness. Okay? Now if you whisper consonants, and you can only whisper some of them, the angelic ones are the whispered ones, which are the ones which are unvoiced. The voiced ones you can't whisper. So if you try and whisper d, it comes out as t, in other words, it's unvoiced. It's the same push, but not as powerful. So it's breathed rather than voiced, so it's non-material. So there was then a language which was angelic, which is whisperable and soft, and there's an intense one which is material. And you can then balance these letters up, so an F voiced becomes a V, and there's sound shifts. You know, B and P, T and D, they're the same letters voiced, they're unvoiced. Z and S. So you've got material situations, and you've got thought installations, where the big one is G and K. So K and G, you can hear the distinct sound shift between the two of them. So his analysis would go far enough into literally the vocalization and where you produce these sounds inside your body. And he would then say mantras are based on this, and mantras are meant to take you back to the pure sound that we had in that Naturasprache, which was pre-Babel. It says in the Bible that the tongues were split because so that no one person could control everybody. He said that was the big thing that stopped Adolf Hitler, because he looks ludicrous to us on the Pathé newsreel when we see him barking at the Germans, you know. And he said, but if you were a German, it hits you at a completely different level. And he said, and he's doing belly sound, and he's holding himself here, and he's barking like an animal at them. If you hear it and hear the voice and the way he gutturalizes German, it's amazing. He said the Japanese were doing exactly the same thing in Japan. If you listen to the samurai speak, they don't have any of the refinement of most sort of delicate Japanese. They bark at you. It's actually talking to somebody today who was saying, you know, the essence of one of the Zen things is that you actually don't think. You answer very, very quickly, and you get your answer out, and you get it hard. It comes back at somebody as a force, because argument, as far as they were concerned, is actually discussion. Discussion means hitting from two sides. You literally form something by not being soft and gentle, but by being aggressive. It stimulates that sort of forming. So what he's saying is that there is a rule to the way language is constructed, and it came from hieroglyphs. All of these were drawings of situations. Chinese, Egyptian, Sumerian, they're all drawings of pictures which were meant to represent particular things, which then got trapped into sounds because it was more effective. But he said animals understand these sounds. That's why, you can make cooing sounds and they respond to what's coming at you. That one means, that oo is often said by chimpanzees, you can hear them saying it, it means want. It is this level personified. It's even in the word want. That's called W. We've lost it. We tend to think of it as a refinement, but actually when I said upsilon has got lost, in Greek it was said like that, it was written like that, those two forms. There you've got a double one. It's also said as V when it went into Latin. So when we're talking, when it says in biblical terms, as you cross boundaries, they distort the language. It's like going from here to Runcorn and hearing the way they speak, or going into Mould and hearing how they speak there. They change the use of consonants and vowels. They manipulate them. So if you've got a W, it means you've got an awful lot of this energy packing into it. Most of our four-letter words have got U's in them. What a coincidence. What is this Halliday man talking about? He'd say you can even take a word and trace it by changing the vowel in it, And that is fascinating to do. And he said you get someone like word.
What was that last sentence that you said about changing the vowel in it? You take a word and change the vowel in it. Is that what you're saying?
Keep the consonants the same, and it gives a whole lightning, by the way. It gives a whole different change. And he said you listen to someone like Bertrand Russell, and he only uses I. Language, he never comes down into that level range. He said he's got nothing going on beneath the diaphragm.
Richard Dawkins says that.
Well, when you hear him describing that, and then saying, okay, so let's look at the words that are based in this thing, so if you say something like love, and where we place it, and then we say it the way they do in Liverpool, like love, it's got a different meaning because a different tone, and you can change it all the way through. He then starts to sound a little bit more coherent, and you think to say, well, it's a hell of a jump to actually say, well, you can do that with every word. But I was at Parklands, and V was there one day at Parklands, where someone said, does this work even in Chinese? And he said it has to. And he said, well, okay, do you speak Chinese? He said, no. And this fellow said a word, and he said, can you translate that for me? And he said, allowing for literally the restrictions that the Chinese put on their own palate, because we would say the Chinese can't say certain letters, Mm-hmm. We're back to Betty Hill and daylight robbery. You would say the Chinese can't eat. It's not true. It's the way that they have been politically distorted, because the Chinese at the north say a lot of the same vowels as we do. So it's literally a political constriction. By habit, they can't say those particular things. And he came back and he said it sounds like some sort of a device for recording information. And he said, and then somebody said, well, what is the word in Chinese? And he said, it means book, which was pretty damn good at the time. Now, he could have been cheating because he could have known Chinese, but that was what happened. We were there when that actually happened. So, it certainly worked for him, but as Bob has said, never had anybody who can do it anything like as well as he did, and he certainly put it into operation, and he was doing it all the time when he was talking to you, constantly.
And he seems to use it to tie in the specifics of an idea as well.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot more. I think it's a lot more complex.
Yeah.
What it is that he does is a lot more complex than simply looking at letters.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the questions that people asked him, like, can you do it in Chinese? I don't even know if that is of any consequence.
Mm.
Because what it seems to be suggesting is that Eugene Halliday could hear anyone speak anywhere on the planet, and he would know what. And I don't.
Yeah.
I find that very difficult to believe. And if you factor in, say, in Chinese, you could say the same word and use the same letters, ma, ma, and they mean two completely different things. There's a wonderful woman called Diana Deutsch who's done a lot of research on this. You can find it on the internet. Words using the same sounds with different inflections.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I remember Eugene talking about, which was ma, which he reckoned was almost a universal. It was the first one I looked up, and there was an example she'd recorded in a Chinese village, 4 ways of saying that word.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like, one meant mother, and the next one meant lawnmower.
Yeah.
And the third one meant, you know...
Chickpeas.
Yeah, something... And you go, well, hang on, they're not even connected.
But you see, one of the things which...
I'm not saying he was wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you. Because it's happened to me. If you try just to learn Welsh, you'll find that they make sounds which you find almost impossible to get right. And what Halliday would say about that is that is because of literally the upbringing which has been stamped into us, because that is how we did it. We separated each other out like that because we didn't trust each other. And language is far more identifiable for us lot who are all of the same colour virtually than anything else we've got. And what is it Bernard Shaw said? As soon as an Englishman opens his mouth, another Englishman either hates him, wants to serve him, wants to get his money off him, literally by the way he speaks. Now, someone comes along like Pinker and says, the language that we use is the way that we trap our tribes. We know if we're in the same tribe by the way we use our words. So it gets highly sophisticated. And what Eugene used to say, which knocked my socks off at the time, he said, the people who make language are the ones who are really in dangerous situations. So, Second World War, airplane fighter pilots were coining words all the time. So were submarine commanders. He said it was standard that the army lingo changed every 4 or 5 months. There was a different word for something. And he said it's the same with drug dealers now. Because if you've got to know who's in and who's out, the language changes every couple of weeks. To stay in with it, you've got to be in the know. Because they've got to know who the outsiders are immediately. Because it's life or death. And you're relying on these people to be with you. He said that's how you literally...
Do you think perhaps, Alan, that there's a certain group of words, like a basic, like form, function, space, do you think there might be, that this applies to like a coterie of words within a language, and then these things like drug dealers going, someone stamped on it, and you go, what does that mean? Oh, they've cut it with something.
Yeah.
How do I know that? And
the books you read.
Yeah, right. And although he probably would know that, that this isn't like this where those important, you know what I mean? The words he does select quite often seem to be essential to some basic.
Elemental.
Yeah. But it's fascinating, isn't it?
I remember doing this with Don on one particular time, and it was fascinating because he had picked up in an obscure literary magazine the fact that some Russian guys were putting language through a computer from all literal sources, and they were finding, which is what was fascinating, and Pinker honed in on this because Pinker uses language to analyse all sorts of situations, and he said the words that were coming up which were similar across 80% of the languages in the world, including the click languages which Pygmies speak, words like mother, MTR, sorry, not the O, MTR sounds were coming up in like 80% of the languages. Father, FOP, TR was coming up, again like that. And then the other words were words for horse, cattle. So Pinker was saying the people who formed our language were obviously farmers. They were not sort of hunters, they were farmers, so that is quite distinct. And the language seemed to travel very slowly, so it didn't travel by conquest, it traveled by marriage. In other words, it travels about 20 miles every generation, which is what they calculate for being the way that people go out and find a wife who lives about 20 miles away, because in village time you had to do that, otherwise you finished up married to your cousin. So you had to go over a certain distance and that. So this is all calculated. It's fascinating to see. And he was saying, and then Pinker comes out with this thing that which it stung me when I found it out. When the Americans started putting Indians into a reservation, they found that you were reducing the amount of space they needed by 1,000-fold. You know, the space that a ranging Indian needed to hunt and to hunt together was so much more than you could contain them in. That's why they put them in reservations. You could reduce the amount of acreage that they needed by 1,000-fold. So Pinker said, well, this is when what we would have to say, we're saying that these people started to farm rather than hunt and gather, so they became extremely efficient. This is culture, this is civilization, this is when we started to live together in large groups, and that's what now people are saying that such a close relationship means you have to become incredibly complicated and duplicitous. In other words, you have to learn to tell lies because you're so pressed in on other people. You can't rely on people and so you can't trust anybody else. Language gets extremely complicated. Culture gets extremely complicated because we are so densely packed. And the brain seems to respond with that. Now, it's a chicken and the egg. They're saying that's when the brain starts to sort of use every one of its neurons, or does it start to use all its neurons and then become able to use language? The chicken or the egg doesn't matter. But they're talking about sort of a period of about 10 to 12,000 years ago when we started to domesticate animals. We got extremely clever about growing things so that we could feed everybody, and we started to get very, very densely populated. That's something which comes through me from another source, but it seems to back up what Halliday was saying, that there would be a common language. I mean, they constantly talked of all the languages from literally Greenland right the way across to Borneo as being, what do they call them now, Indo-European. At one time they used to call them Aryan. They used to think there was one tribe of people that conquered everybody else and taught them one language. Now they just call it Indo-European. And they say the root languages from that are Sanskrit, and Greek and Hebrew are the ones that lead you back into it. And there are so many words common in them. We know that they came from one basic language that must have been the root of all the others. Doesn't go into Chinese, although a lot of Chinese words are with the restricted palate.
But that's a different thing than saying, let's agree, let's go, there was one basic language. But that's not the same thing as saying, and there's a significance, a correspondence
That's true, yeah.
between the signs you use on paper or something to indicate the sound and some principle, which is, and it seems to work. Does it? I mean, if you come away from here going, well, I know a lot, space to me was just like, this, but you know what, you think about it like this, there's a door opens and you go,
That's what he used to say.
extraordinary.
Yeah, and he used to say that about, he said hermeneutic, he considered himself to be a hermeneut, by the way. If you look up hermeneutics, it's got a different sort of meaning nowadays. It's the interpretation of stories and the interpretation of myths.
Yeah.
And I said to him, when I trace some of these words, they don't seem to be exactly the same as yours. And he says, no, but mine are the best. and he said, by best, I mean they are the ones that lead you to freedom. The other ones lead you to bondage. Because there are two keys in the world, and you see them on gates heraldically. There are two keys in the world. The cross keys are the keys of loosening and the keys of binding. And what happened when they moved from the natural language into Babel, one language was for literally tying you up, and one was for loosening you. and you use whichever one is required for a situation. You loosen language with your friends, and you tie people up with language if you're trying to box them into a corner and trap them. And this is what you have to do. So those are the keys of loosening and binding, and they're often used by in Masonic type organizations who feel that they can understand how words are being used to manipulate us, often distorted to be given completely the opposite meaning than the one that they were originally designed to have. But, like for instance, words, once you realize common meaning, is you find that, okay, what's the similarity between bank and bank? A bank doesn't look like a river bank. Oh yes, it does. You pile things up in it. It's a storage place. It stores things and it banks and it separates things out. So there is a functional, if you like, relationship between a lot of words, which Halliday would bring out and use them as memnomics, in other words, to help you remember that you're often being tied up in a situation by people who are using words around you. That's the other thing he stressed. If you don't understand words properly and somebody else does, they'll box you off. They'll tie you into a corner by the language that they use. So it behoves you to be interested in study and look up words if they actually confuse you. Get a bigger vocabulary. But if you analyze it down to syllables, he would say, if you look at prefixes and suffixes in terms of an etymological dictionary, you'll find that there's very few of them. There's millions of letters, millions of words, very few syllables. So learn the syllables and you don't have to learn so many words. You're learning less and less about more and more. So you need less, and then you can build your own words together, and then someone hits you with a new word that they've just invented, you can usually analyze it into what it means. I remember someone else saying to him about jet plane, okay, well, what about the words jet plane? He said, well, both those words are at least medieval. They had jets, 1,000 years ago. They knew what a jet was. It wasn't an airplane and it wasn't an engine, but it was something that squirted out. And a plane literally has always meant something flat, a planar. He said, so if you put the things together, you're saying there's something which jets out and creates a plane, or something which flattens out and moves. So they've only borrowed words. He said most of them borrow words from Greek or Latin. And now we're running out of so many words, we're tending to borrow words from Sanskrit. So that astronomers now use Sanskrit words and Hindi words and things like this, because we've used up so many of the Greek ones, they become almost meaningless. So if you look up upsilon, as I did the other day, you'll find that it's got references in physics and chemistry. It means particular processes in all these systems. Nothing new under the sun, he used to say. And not much new beyond